Hey guys, it's now time for chapter 6 and 7 of Woods Runner. We left Samuel in a tight spot again last chapter. After his settlement had been burned and he realized that his parents were taken captive, he decided to track the captors and the people who had been captured to rescue his parents. And we don't really know why his parents were not killed along with everyone else in the settlement. Everyone in the surrounding cabins by his cabin were murdered except for 7 people. So what's special about those 7 people, and why were Samuel's parents included? I'm excited to find out. So also we know that the killing style of the captors is very unusual. They use tomahawks and scalping and arrows, but we are aware that 2 of the people, because of Samuel's amazing hunting skills, are wearing actual shoes, and I don't know of any Indians that wear boots. They just wear moccasins, so I'm interested to see more about that. So Samuel has been tracking them. He thought they were a whole day ahead of him, but now he thinks it's much less, because when he came upon another settlement, it had been ravaged just like his own. So they're stopping and taking more captives and killing more people, so they can't be that far in front of him. So let's join him back on his hunt for his parents. Chapter 6. As he walked, Samuel felt like he were following some kind of killing storm. Even the tracks seemed savage. From the footprints, it was evident that the prisoners, tied together, were constantly jerked and pulled to increase their speed. Their prints were scuffed, ragged, and he felt his mother's anguish terribly. She was small and thin and very strong in her own way, but this brutal treatment, probably with a rope around her neck, might be too much for her. If she was too slow, they might... He could not finish the thought. The shock Samuel had felt since he'd come upon the devastation in the settlement and dealt with the bodies had left him numb. Now it turned to anger, coming into rage. And that was worse, because he had to remain calm. He had no idea what to do except follow his parents' tracks. He saw their footprints now and then. He had to follow and rescue them. How could he do that? Free his parents? He'd have to wait and see. Wait until he knew more. He could learn by studying sign. He could not forget himself and his skills now. The people who were leaving the tracks were the people he had to deal with. He had to understand them by the time he caught up with them. He'd stopped and tried to slow his harsh breathing, tried to still his mind and remember all he had taught himself about studying trails and the surrounding ground. It seemed that all of the captors and captives were still walking on the trail, but there might be others off to the side. Quickly, he started to swing to the left and right of the trail. It was mostly grass and hard to read, but at last he saw scuff marks and some moccasin tracks in open dirt. They had scouts on either side of the main group. On the second swing, he found the first body. It was a man in his 30s who'd been picking berries when they'd come upon him. He must have had a rifle or musket. No one would be out in the open woods without some kind of weapon. But it was gone, along with his powder horn and Possible's bag. He had been scalped, mutilated. Sadly, there was no time for Samuel to give him a decent grave. He scraped a slight trench with his knife and covered the body with a minimum of dirt. He bowed his head, then went back to the trail. Covering the body hadn't taken much time, but it upset him. As he walked on, he tried to still the shaking of his hands. He picked up his speed and came into the clearing of the next settlement before he was ready for it. He thought he knew what he would find. It was just the few cabins, but unlike Samuel's home, it had a name, Draper's Crossing, and it was gone. At first, it seemed the same devastation he had found at home, smoke rising from burned cabins and sheds. But when he stopped, he saw he wasn't alone. On the southern side of the clearing, there was a figure. It was an old man. As Samuel approached, he saw that the man was spading dirt with a wooden shovel on a mound that was clearly a grave, and he was singing, "Rocks of ages cleft for me, let me hide myself in thee." Samuel stopped 10 yards away. He saw no weapon, but he stood ready, rifle held across his chest, thumb on the hammer. As the old man patted the dirt with the shovel, Samuel could see 4 other grave mounds where the cabins had been. The man said in a sing-song voice, "There to sleepy little darling, there to sleepy with the Jesus boy. All to sleepy little darling, all to sleepy with the Jesus boy." Samuel coughed, but the old man did not turn. Jesus came, the Jesus boy came and took them all up to heaven. "How long ago were they here?" Samuel finally interrupted the man's song. The man turned toward Samuel and kept up his singing. "Lordy, then the Jesus boy came and took them all to heaven. There was Draper and Molly, and they came in and took them all to the Jesus boy." "How long ago? Can you tell me when they were here?" "In the dark they came, took them all to the Jesus boy. Took them all, but not old Bobby. No, sir, didn't take old Bobby, 'cause old Bobby, he sat eating dirt and pointing up at the Jesus boy and talking through his ear holes. And they thinking old Bobby was tetched, but it wasn't so. Water. Is there water or food here?" "Wasn't touched at all. Just knew how the Jesus boy could save us. So I sat there eating dirt and laughing and praying." With piercing, intense, and otherworldly green eyes, he stared, but not at Samuel. He looked through Samuel at some far place that only he could see, only he could know. He picked up the shovel and started walking off to the south, where Samuel could see one more burned cabin. Beside it lay what looked like a pile of rags, but Samuel knew it wasn't. One more body. Now he remembered something he had heard about the Indians. Considering that he had lived his whole life on the frontier, he knew very little about them, but what he did know he had learned by listening to adults, to rumors and stories they sometimes told after they'd had a little too much hard cider or blackstrap rum. He remembered that some tribes saw crazy people as graced by the higher power, and that they believed that older people who did not think straight should be protected, or at least not harmed, which must be why they had let old Bobby go. "Maybe he is crazy," Samuel said aloud, watching him walk away with the shovel. "And maybe not. Either way, he's alive." He turned back to the trail. If old Bobby was right, they had come in the dark, probably just before dawn, if they had stopped to rest at all. That meant Samuel was gaining, and that meant he had to keep moving. The world, a fact sheet. The War of Independence very rapidly turned into something like a world war. Native Americans fought on both sides, and Spain got involved on the American side, or at least its navy did. Germany sent the mercenaries known as Hessians. The French were a staunch ally of the United States. Staunch ally? Were a staunch ally of the United States, with their navy keeping England from resupplying her troops and distancing it from the American navy. The English navy, in fact, was so preoccupied with the French that it could not focus on the American problem. So it's pretty crazy that many other countries around the world were involved in the American Revolution. And something important we just learned here is that the Native Americans fought on both sides of the war. When I read the back of the book to you in the first video, I mentioned that the Iroquois were also creating savage attacks. And it might be so that the Iroquois tribe fought for the British. Although they did fight on both sides, we have yet to see any Native Americans who have been fighting for the American side. So I'm excited to see how that evolves. Now I'm going to read chapter 7. He had been running for 40 hours now. Just as he left Draper's Crossing, he passed a cornfield that the attackers had tried to burn. Some ears of corn had been roasted. Hunger took him like a wolf, and he grabbed half a dozen ears, jamming them in his clothing. He ate as he walked, letting the sweet corn juice slide down his throat and into his stomach. The hunger was so intense that eating the corn made his jaws ache. The food made his body demand water. He hadn't taken time to find a well or where one was. When he had come to a small creek, he stopped to drink. The water was muddy where the creek crossed the trail, so he moved off into the thick underbush 20 yards upstream to the creek where it ran clear. He knelt to put his mouth to the water, and this act saved his life. His lips had no sooner touched the water that he heard men's voices. It was a native tongue, and they were loud and laughing. There were 2 of them. Had they come upon Samuel, they surely would have taken or killed him. Samuel kept his head near the ground. Through small holes in the bush, he could see them from the waist down. They wore leather leggings and high moccasins, and each carried a musket in one hand. He could see the butts hanging down by their sides, and either a coop stick or a killing lance in the other. Both of the men had fresh scalps hanging on the shafts they carried. For the first time in his life, Samuel wanted to kill a man. The overwhelming rage that he had begun to feel while following his mother's small footprints as she'd been savagely jerked along the trail was like a hot knife in his brain. If there had only been one, he would have done it. But he carried no tomahawk. All he had was a skinning knife, and his rifle fired only one shot. After that, the one he didn't shoot would turn on him before he could reload. With only a knife to defend himself, he'd have almost no chance. So he waited until they were out of sight. Then, staying low and moving slowly, he went back to the trail. Why had the men come back? Whatever the reason, 2 men alone would not backtrack too far into a potentially hostile country. If there were any kind of force after them, they would want to keep moving. So Samuel thought, maybe I'm getting closer. He picked up the pace to a jog, but stayed well to the side of the trail on the edge of the thick undergrowth in case he ran into any others. And again, this move saved his life. Clearing left by the old beaver ponds were scattered through the forest. Clearings left by old beaver ponds were scattered through the forest. Some were small, an acre or 2. Others were 30 or 40 acres. A large clearing popped up in front of Samuel now. It was late afternoon, almost evening, and the sun slanted from the west behind him into the clearing. It was another stroke of luck. The clearing had been turned into a large encampment filled with Indians, some British soldiers in red uniforms, and nearly a quarter of a mile away, freight wagons hooked up to horses. Samuel slid into the underbrush. He crawled farther back where he couldn't be seen. Unfortunately, he couldn't see either, and he squatted in the thick foliage and tried to remember what he'd seen. 3 wagons ready to go. 10 or 15 soldiers, including 3 officers on horses, and 10 or 15 Indians. He shook his head. No, not that many soldiers. 7 or 8, and fewer Indians, 8 or 9. On the large fire in the center of the clearing, one smaller, one closer to the wagons, a group of people huddled there. The captives. There hadn't been time to see them clearly, and they were too far away for him to see his mother and father, if his mother and father were in the group. In a rope pen near the wagon were 1 or 2 horses, 3 or 4 oxen, maybe a milk cow. There was also a spit set up over the large fire with some kind of big animal cooking, which meant they were going to be here for some time, perhaps the night. He settled slowly back onto his haunches, careful not to move the bush around him. He had caught up to them. There was a chance his mother and father were with that group of captives. He still had no plan to rescue them. Everything he'd done was just to catch up, see if they were still alive. Could they be here? He hadn't come across their bodies on the trail, and there were captives by the fire. For the moment, that was enough. The plan would come later. It would soon be dark. There was still no moon. Now he was astonished that it had only been 40 or so hours since he'd returned from the hunt. His whole life, everything in it and around it was different now, torn and gutted, and forever changed from all it had been. It would never be the same. It would be dark soon, and in the dark, he thought, with no moon in the near pitch dark of starlight, there might be possibilities. He had no plan, but it would be dark soon. And just then, as he settled back to wait and think on some way to get to the captives without being discovered, the whole world blew up. And that concludes chapter 7. I wonder what just happened. The whole world blew up? Okay, fact sheet about warfare. The British procedure when fighting was to march at the foe in a close line with 2 or 3 ranks of men. The front rank would fire at 60 or 50 yards, then drop back and reload while the second rank stepped forward and fired, dropping back and reloading while the back rank came forward and fired. This rolling volley had the effect of creating a kind of mass firepower. The weapons were very simple, but it was almost impossible to stand against the line when the men grew close, quit firing altogether, and charged, screaming. It took a special kind of courage to stand ready with a line of howling men, when a line of howling men ran at you with bayonets aimed at your stomach. Many times, American soldiers turned and ran rather than face the British army, called the Wall of British Steel. Can you imagine that? Ooh, I could not be a soldier. So, guys, don't forget to take your notes on Chapter 6 and Chapter 7, especially about what you learned about how maybe Native Americans have a spiritual belief that crazy old men have a higher power, and so they refuse to kill them. And then definitely about how he found the captives, but there's still no plan, and then the world blew up. How did that happen? So think about it. Imagine what it could be, and you will find out tomorrow. Bye.